Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history. Today we'll delve into a story the textbooks preferred to forget, a tale too dark to be taught in schools, involving a woman whose reputation teetered between sainthood and something far more sinister. Let us know where you're watching from, because this story will traverse mountains, valleys, and the darkest corners of 19th century North Carolina. It was mid-1863, when the Civil War was still tearing the United States apart, leaving deep scars in every corner of the country. In the Appalachian Mountains, especially in western North Carolina, the conflict had created a power vacuum and a sense of abandonment that penetrated the bones of isolated communities. The roads were precarious, little more than muddy trails winding between centuries-old pines and oaks. Thick fog blanketed the valleys in the morning, and the silence was broken only by the wind whistling through the rocky canyons. Into this desolate landscape emerged Sarah Denton, a 41-year-old woman who had built a peculiar reputation among the mountain dwellers. She presented herself as an independent missionary, someone who brought spiritual comfort and material assistance to those most in need. Sarah traveled alone, a rarity for a woman at the time, carrying a worn leather suitcase and always wearing sober, almost funereal clothing. Her face was described as stern in surviving records, with piercing eyes that seemed to probe the soul of anyone who crossed her path. The earliest accounts of Sarah Denton appear in the archives of Haywood County, in a mountainous region near the Tennessee border. She arrived during the harsh winter of 1862, when many families faced hunger and despair caused by the war. Husbands and adult sons had gone off to fight, leaving wives and elderly people in charge of entire farms. Sarah offered prayers, small amounts of food she carried with her, and most importantly promises of better days through faith and penance. But there was something about the way Sarah conducted her work that disturbed some residents. She never associated with any established church, whether Methodist, Baptist, or Presbyterian. Her sermons took place in abandoned barns, isolated clearings, or even inside the homes that welcomed her. Witnesses from the time described strange rituals, prolonged prayers lasting hours, and extreme fasts that she imposed on herself and those who sought her spiritual guidance. The local newspaper, the Waynesville Mountain Herald, published a brief note in March of 1863 about a pious woman who roams our mountains offering solace to the afflicted. The note was positive, almost reverential, but it ended with a curious observation. Although her methods are unconventional by established standards, this seemingly innocent phrase held layers of meaning that would only be revealed months later, when the first disappearances began to be linked to Sarah's presence in the communities. During the spring of that year, 3 people disappeared without a trace in different villages in the mountain region. First was Margaret Holloway, a 57-year-old widow who lived alone in a cabin near the Pigeon River. Neighbors reported that Sarah had spent several days staying with Margaret, undergoing what she called an intensive spiritual retreat. When other residents went to visit Margaret 2 weeks later, they found the house empty, the door swinging open in the wind and no sign of the owner. All her belongings were there, including a small amount of cash hidden under the mattress. The second disappearance occurred in Madison County, on the higher slopes near the community of Marshall. Thomas Garrett, a 62-year-old man who had lost his legs in a gangrene epidemic years earlier, lived on a property inherited from his parents. He was known for his voluntary solitude and a certain bitterness toward life. Sarah appeared, offering specific spiritual care for those carrying invisible burdens of the soul. Thomas accepted her company. 3 weeks later, when a nephew traveled from Tennessee to visit him, he found the house locked from the inside, but completely deserted. Thomas had simply vanished. The third case was even more disturbing. Elizabeth Crane, 49, was known as a midwife and traditional healer in the Hot Springs area. She had a bit of a silent rivalry with Sarah, as they both offered services that bordered on the spiritual. Locals reported a tense conversation between the 2 women on the porch of the general store, where Sarah allegedly said something about paths that cross only once. Elizabeth disappeared one June night, leaving behind her bag of medical instruments and herbs, something she would never willingly abandon. We're just scratching the surface of this dark story, unfolding in the misty Appalachian Mountains. 3 people went missing, a missionary with no church, and an entire region began to whisper questions no one dared ask aloud. What was Sarah Denton really doing during those extended spiritual retreats? Why did the people who received her most intense attention seem to vanish like smoke? And most disturbingly, Why did local authorities seem so reluctant to investigate a woman who carried a Bible and spoke about salvation? The following months brought an atmosphere of distrust that hung over the mountain communities like a permanent fog in the valleys. Sarah Denton continued her itinerant journey, appearing in ever more distant villages, always carrying that leather suitcase and her black-bound Bible. What made it all the more disconcerting was the way she seemed to anticipate people's needs, arriving just when someone was experiencing moments of extreme vulnerability. In Buncombe County, near the city of Asheville, Sarah established a temporary camp of sorts during the summer of 1863. She pitched a small canvas tent in a clearing off the main road, where she welcomed visitors seeking spiritual guidance. The site was surrounded by towering chestnut trees that blocked sunlight, even at midday, creating a constant gloom that some described as oppressive. The sound of the nearby creek drowned out conversations, making it impossible for anyone nearby to hear what was happening during Sarah's sessions with her followers. It was during this period that the story of Abigail Morton emerged, a 38-year-old woman recently widowed when her husband was killed in an ambush by deserting Confederate soldiers. Abigail was devastated not only by the loss, but also by her desperate financial situation. The farm was mortgaged, the crops had failed, and she had no close relatives to help her. When Sarah Denton appeared, offering not only spiritual comfort but also promises of divine provision through material detachment, Abigail saw a lifeline. Witnesses reported that Abigail began spending entire days at Sarah's camp, returning home only to care for the animals and then returning for prayer sessions. Her demeanor visibly changed. The once communicative woman became silent and distant. Neighbors who tried to talk to her received monosyllabic answers and blank stares. A woman named Prudence Walker, who lived on the adjacent property, later described to the sheriff that Abigail seemed to be walking in a disturbing dream from which she could not awaken. The last time Abigail Morton was seen alive was on an August afternoon, when she walked towards Sarah's camp carrying a bundle of clothes. She told Prudence she was going on a spiritual purification retreat that would last several days. When a week passed without news, Prudence convinced her husband to go to the clearing. They found the place completely abandoned. The tent had been dismantled, there was no trace of Sarah Denton's presence, and Abigail had simply disappeared. The woman's farm was found locked, the animals lowing in the corral with hunger, and no clue as to her whereabouts. The Buncombe County Sheriff, a man named Josiah Reynolds, finally decided the disappearances could no longer be ignored. He was a veteran of the Mexican War, accustomed to difficult situations, but even he admitted in personal correspondence that Sarah Denton's case made him deeply uncomfortable. How could he investigate a woman who apparently committed no obvious crimes? She didn't steal, she didn't threaten, she didn't force anyone into anything. People would simply disappear after spending extended time in her company. Reynolds began collecting statements and tracking Sarah's movements across the counties. What he discovered formed a disturbing pattern. Sarah consistently targeted isolated individuals without strong family ties, often widows or widowers with some property or modest savings. She spent weeks or even months cultivating trust, offering genuine spiritual comfort at first, before gradually intensifying prayer sessions and periods of fasting. Witnesses described how the victim seemed to enter a state of absolute submission, obeying Sarah as if she were a figure of unquestionable divine authority. What disturbed Reynolds most was the complete absence of bodies or physical evidence of foul play. No signs of violence, no suspicious stains, no objects that indicated a struggle or resistance. People simply ceased to exist, as if they had crossed over into another dimension. The missing people's properties remained untouched, their money remained where it was, and their land ownership documents remained in the same places. Sarah seemed uninterested in obvious material gain, which made her motives all the more obscure and terrifying. During his investigations, Reynolds discovered something that shed new light on Sarah Denton's past. She had first appeared in the Appalachian region in 1858, apparently from Kentucky. But before that, her trail was lost in a fog of conflicting reports and unconfirmed rumors. Some claimed she had been married to a Methodist minister who died under mysterious circumstances. Others whispered that she had been expelled from a secluded religious community for practicing unapproved rituals. Some even claimed that Sarah was not her real name, but an identity she assumed after some traumatic event in her youth. In September 1863, The Asheville Spectator published a cautious article titled "Concerns about Itinerant Missionary." The article avoided direct accusations but listed the disappearances and raised uncomfortable questions about the coincidence of all being linked to the same person. The publication caused a stir in the mountain communities. Some people passionately defended Sarah, saying she had brought genuine comfort in dark times. Others began locking their doors when they heard rumors that the missionary was approaching their areas. Sarah Denton responded to the growing suspicions the only way she knew how: by disappearing. In late September, she simply vanished from the North Carolina mountains. No one saw her go, no one knew where she had gone. She left behind a trail of unsolved mysteries and families torn apart by uncertainty. The missing were never found, dead or alive. Their properties were eventually seized for debt or occupied by distant relatives. Life continued in the mountains, but Sarah's shadow remained as a grim reminder that not all apparent goodness comes from a pure place. The winter of 1863 arrived early that year, bringing blizzards that isolated many Appalachian communities for weeks at a time. Sheriff Reynolds's investigations cooled along with the weather, not for lack of will, but because of the practical impossibility of traveling between counties when the roads turned into rivers of frozen mud. It was during this period of enforced silence that the first reports emerged from neighboring Tennessee, suggesting that Sarah Denton had simply crossed the mountains and resumed her activities in new territory. Rumors reached traders who traveled between Knoxville and Asheville when conditions permitted. They spoke of a missionary woman who had appeared in the isolated valleys of eastern Tennessee near the Smoky Mountains, offering the same spiritual services that Sarah provided in North Carolina. The description fit perfectly. A middle-aged woman, always dressed in dark clothes, carrying a Bible and a leather suitcase, non-denominational preaching, and a disturbing ability to identify vulnerable people. Reynolds tried to establish communication with Tennessee authorities, but the ongoing war made any coordination between states extremely difficult. Letters took weeks to reach their destination, if they arrived at all. The telegraph system, which could have facilitated communication, was reserved primarily for military matters. The sheriff found himself in a frustrating position. He knew something terribly wrong was happening, but he lacked the resources or jurisdiction to act beyond his own county's borders. Meanwhile, in the icy mountains of East Tennessee, a new series of events began to unfold. Sarah had temporarily settled near the community of Cosby, in a region known for its dense forests and scattered farms. Cocky County was even more isolated than the areas where she had previously operated. Families lived separated by miles of winding trails. The law was patchy, and government presence was almost non-existent due to resources diverted to the war effort. It was there that Sarah found her next victim, a man named Nathaniel Porter. He was 46 years old and had returned from the war with injuries that left him unable to work the fields as he once did. Nathaniel lived alone in a cabin inherited from his parents, farming only enough to subsist. He was known locally as someone haunted by his experiences on the battlefield, often waking in the night to screams echoing through the valley. His nearest neighbors, who lived nearly 2 miles away, had learned to ignore these disturbing sounds. Sarah appeared at Nathaniel's door one November afternoon, offering specific prayers for those tormented by visions of death and destruction. She claimed to know methods of spiritual purification that could free the soul from the horrors she had witnessed. Nathaniel, desperate for any form of relief from his nightly torments, received her gratefully. Later witnesses reported seeing them together a few times at the community general store, where Sarah bought provisions with money that, curiously, never seemed to run out despite her having no visible occupation. The pattern repeated itself. Nathaniel began to isolate himself even more, refusing visits from the few acquaintances who occasionally appeared. He was seen walking the trails alongside Sarah, his head always down, moving as if in a trance. A woman named Martha Blevins, who was passing through the area selling fabrics, described an unsettling encounter. She had stopped at Nathaniel's cabin to offer her wares and found Sarah sitting in a chair on the porch, still as a statue, while Nathaniel inside recited prayers in a language Martha couldn't identify, neither English nor any dialect she knew. In December of that year, as the first heavy snows blanketed the mountains, Nathaniel Porter disappeared. His cabin was found empty by a distant cousin who had traveled from Virginia to visit him. The house was in order, the firewood stacked, the supplies stored, but no sign of Nathaniel or Sarah Denton. What caught the cousin's attention was one particular detail. In the center of the main room, on the wooden floor, were strange markings drawn with what appeared to be charcoal ash. These were symbols that didn't correspond to any known religious tradition, circles intertwined with intersecting lines, forming complex geometric patterns. The local sheriff, a man named William Hodges, was less dedicated than Reynolds of North Carolina. He reported the disappearance but didn't launch a serious investigation. The war was still consuming resources and attention, and a lone man disappearing in the mountains wasn't considered a priority. Hodges assumed Nathaniel had simply moved on, seeking a fresh start away from the traumatic memories. As for the symbols on the ground, he considered them the product of a mind disturbed by the war, nothing more. But Sarah wasn't finished in Tennessee. During the winter, she moved deeper into the state, following the frozen valleys and rivers to even more remote regions. In January of 1864, she appeared in Sevier County, near Gatlinburg. There, in a community so small it didn't even have an official name on maps, she encountered two elderly sisters living together on an inherited farm. Clara and Judith Ramsey were 63 and 65, respectively, never married, and known for their generous hospitality despite their limited resources. Sarah spent weeks staying with the Ramsey sisters. Neighbors visiting the farm noticed gradual changes in the two women's behavior. Once chatty and cheerful, they became quiet and distant. The weekly sewing meetings they usually hosted were cancelled without explanation. The local church received a message through a messenger saying that the sisters would no longer attend services, as they had found a more direct spiritual path through Sarah's guidance. The church's reverend, a man named Elijah Thornton, was concerned enough to make an unannounced visit to the Ramsey farm in February. What he found deeply disturbed him. The sisters were visibly thinner, with dark circles under their eyes and slow movements. The house, once impeccably clean, was in disarray. Sarah met the reverend at the door and politely but firmly refused him entry, saying the sisters were on an intensive spiritual retreat and could not be disturbed. Thornton insisted on speaking to Clara and Judith, but they appeared briefly at the window, waved that all was well, and disappeared back into the house. 2 weeks later, when Reverend Thornton returned with two church deacons, they found the farm completely abandoned. The Ramsey sisters were gone, Sarah Denton was missing, and the house was locked from the outside. When they forced their way inside, they discovered that all the sisters' belongings remained, including family jewelry stored in a wooden box that any burglar would have taken. The kitchen bore signs of recent meals, but no evidence of a struggle or violence. It was as if the three women had simply vanished into the frigid mountain air. Reverend Thornton went to Sheriff Hodges, demanding an investigation, but again met resistance. Hodges argued that adult women had the right to come and go as they pleased, and that the sisters had likely decided to accompany Sarah on her missionary journeys. There was no body, no obvious crime, no legal reason to search for them. Thornton persisted, but bureaucracy and indifference prevailed. The case was filed as a voluntary disappearance, and life went on in the dark mountains. We're witnessing an increasingly clear and terrifying pattern. Sarah Denton moved like a shadow across the mountains, leaving voids where people once stood. What did she really do to those who trusted her? How could she make people simply disappear without a trace? And why did the authorities seem so unable or unwilling to stop her? The spring of 1864 brought a thaw in the mountains, and with it, discoveries that would finally force authorities to take Sarah Denton seriously. A hunter named Jacob Whitmore was following deer tracks in the dense woods near the French Broad River, on the border between Cock and Sevier counties, when he stumbled upon something that would completely change the course of the investigation. Hidden beneath layers of dead leaves and twigs, in a deep ravine far from any known trail, he found personal belongings that had clearly been deliberately discarded. There were women's clothing, a Bible with the name Clara Ramsey written on the inside cover, property documents belonging to Nathaniel Porter, a leather suitcase identical to the description several witnesses had given of Sarah Denton's luggage, and other personal items that were later identified as belonging to various missing persons. Most disturbing was a black leather-bound notebook filled with notes written in a tight, slanted hand. The pages contained lists of names, dates, property descriptions, and amounts of money, interspersed with strange symbols and excerpts of prayers that appeared to be distorted versions of biblical passages. Jacob Whitmore took everything directly to Sheriff Hodges, who this time couldn't simply ignore the evidence. He summoned North Carolina Sheriff Reynolds and representatives from other counties where disappearances had been reported. For the first time, authorities began connecting the dots across state lines and realized they were dealing with something much larger and more sinister than isolated cases of people simply changing addresses. Sarah's notebook was meticulously studied by several people, including Reverend Thornton, who had formal education and could decipher the intricate writing. What he discovered within the stained, yellowed pages was a detailed record of systematic psychological manipulation. Sarah noted her victims' personality traits, their specific vulnerabilities, deep fears, and secret desires. She documented how each prayer session affected the person, which fasting and sleep deprivation techniques worked best, and at what precise point each individual reached what she called a state of total receptivity. Even more disturbing were the references to a place Sarah called the Sanctuary of Final Transformation. She wrote of taking the chosen ones to this location when they were ready, when they had completely shed their former identities and were prepared to pass through the veil. The notes were deliberately vague about the exact location of this sanctuary, but they contained clues to a cave deep in the mountains, accessible only by trails Sarah had carefully mapped over the years. Authorities organized search expeditions based on the notebook's clues. For weeks, groups of armed men roamed the most remote areas of the Smoky Mountains, investigating known caves and exploring rock formations that might conceal secret entrances. The task was monumental. The mountains contained thousands of caves, many never before catalogued, and the dense vegetation made it impossible to cover the entire territory systematically. Furthermore, the Civil War was not yet over, and resources were extremely limited. It was a local guide named Samuel Creek, a man of Cherokee descent who knew the mountains like few others, who finally found something significant. In May of that year, he located a cave hidden behind a seasonal waterfall high in the mountains, in a region so steep and dangerous that very few would venture there. The entrance was narrow, disguised by dense vegetation, and only visible from certain angles. Samuel noticed signs of recent passage, branches intentionally broken to mark the way, rocks moved to facilitate the climb, unmistakable signs that someone used this route regularly. Sheriff Hodges, accompanied by Reynolds and a group of 6 armed men, followed Samuel to the cave. They carried torches and lanterns, ropes and provisions for an exploration that could last days. The entrance led to a natural tunnel that descended at a steep angle, the walls damp and slippery, the air growing colder and heavier with every foot. The sound of dripping water echoed eerily, and everyone felt a growing oppression as they advanced deeper into the mountain. After nearly an hour of careful descent, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. What they found inside chilled even the most seasoned men. The cave had been transformed into a macabre shrine of sorts. The walls were covered in the same symbols found in Nathaniel Porter's cabin, drawn in ash and what appeared to be animal fat. Candles were arranged in concentric circles, though they had been unlit long enough to accumulate layers of dust. In the center of the chamber, a natural rock formation had been modified to serve as a sort of altar, with books stacked high and personal belongings carefully arranged. But there were no bodies. No human remains, no signs of physical violence, no evidence of the final fate of the people Sarah had brought to this place. What made everything even more disturbing was precisely this absence. The men searched every corner of the chamber and explored adjacent tunnels that branched off in different directions. They found more symbols, more candles, more personal items belonging to the missing, but no definitive answers as to what had happened to them. Reynolds found something that made him pause in the middle of the cave, holding his flashlight with trembling hands. It was a pile of neatly folded clothes, each marked with embroidered initials. He recognized some as belonging to people who had disappeared in North Carolina months before. The clothes were clean, organized with almost obsessive precision, as if their owners had voluntarily removed them and left them there as part of some ritual. Alongside the clothes were farewell letters, written in different scripts, all following a similar pattern. Declarations of renunciation of the material world, expressions of gratitude to Sarah for showing them the true path, and promises that they would finally find peace through transformation. The men spent 2 days exploring the cave complex, mapping tunnels and documenting everything they found. They discovered smaller chambers that Sarah apparently used as forced meditation sites, spaces so cramped a person could barely sit, where she likely kept her victims in sensory isolation for prolonged periods. There were scratch marks on the rock walls, evidence of desperation and attempts to escape, but there were also religious texts hand-copied into the smoother surfaces, suggesting that at some point, resistance gave way to acceptance. Reverend Thornton, who had insisted on accompanying the expedition despite his advanced age, spent hours poring over the writing on the walls. He concluded that Sarah had created her own deeply distorted theology, blending elements of traditional Christianity with radical interpretations of purification through suffering and transcendence through the annihilation of the ego. She believed, or at least persuaded others to believe, that she was offering a path to a higher form of existence that required the complete abandonment of earthly identity. But the question that haunted everyone remained unanswered. Where were the people? If they didn't die in the cave, where did they go? The tunnels were explored as far as physically possible, but many were too narrow for human passage or ended in solid rock walls. There were no obvious secret exits, no path leading elsewhere. It was as if Sarah's victims had literally vanished from the face of the earth after passing through that subterranean sanctuary. The discovery of the cave turned Sarah Denton's case into an obsession for the authorities involved. Sheriff Reynolds, in particular, seemed unable to think of anything else. He spent weeks camped near the cave entrance, overseeing increasingly deeper and more desperate explorations. Mining engineers were called in to assess the geological structure, hoping to identify hidden chambers or passages that the initial explorers had missed. But the mountains guarded their secrets with relentless tenacity. During this period of intense investigation, reports of Sarah's sightings began to emerge in increasingly remote locations. A woman matching her description was reportedly seen in Knoxville in late May, buying passage on a stagecoach heading south. Another witness swore to seeing her at a Methodist church in Chattanooga in June, sitting alone in the back pew, watching the sermon with that piercing gaze so many had described. A Nashville merchant reported a strange conversation with an itinerant missionary who spoke of bringing spiritual comfort to the afflicted in rural Georgia. Reynolds sent letters to sheriffs throughout the American South, warning of Sarah Denton and providing detailed descriptions. But communication was slow and unreliable during those final months of the Civil War. Many letters never reached their destination. Others were ignored by authorities who had more pressing concerns, including wounded soldiers returning home, the collapsing economy, and the entire social fabric crumbling under the strain of prolonged conflict. It was during this chaotic period that the lawyer for one of the affected families, a polite man named Herbert Blackwood, began his own parallel investigation. Blackwood represented the distant heirs of Margaret Holloway, Sarah's first known victim in North Carolina. He was trying to resolve issues of property and inheritance, but found he couldn't simply declare Margaret dead without some concrete evidence of her fate. This led him to delve into the details of the case in a way that authorities, overwhelmed by multiple responsibilities, couldn't. Blackwood was meticulous and patient. He personally traveled to each location where Sarah had operated, spoke with dozens of witnesses, collected every scrap of information available, and began to build a psychological profile of the woman. What he uncovered through his private investigations was both fascinating and terrifying. Sarah Denton was not simply a common criminal or even a conventional killer. She was something more complex and deeply disturbing, a master manipulator who had transformed human vulnerability into a macabre art form. Through conversations with people who had known Sarah but managed to resist her influence, Blackwood identified her method. First, she identified isolated individuals experiencing profound existential crises, recent grief, war trauma, extreme loneliness, chronic illnesses that affected their ability to work. She initially offered genuine comfort, building trust through small acts of kindness and personalized attention that these individuals rarely received from others. Gradually, Sarah introduced elements of her distorted theology. She preached how earthly suffering was an illusion created by attachment to material identity, how true peace could only be found through the complete dissolution of the ego. She used prolonged fasting to weaken her victims' mental resistance, combined with prayer sessions lasting hours, repeating mantras until they entered altered states of consciousness. Social isolation was crucial. She persuaded her victims to withdraw from family and friends, creating a total dependence on her presence and guidance. Blackwood discovered something particularly disturbing through a witness who had briefly fallen under Sarah's influence, but managed to escape before it was too late. A woman named Rebecca Summers, who lived in Madison County, reported that Sarah had begun to speak of a special place where chosen people could undergo a final transformation. She described this process as a symbolic death, followed by a spiritual rebirth, where the person would completely leave behind their former identity and emerge as a purified being, freed from all the burdens of worldly existence. Rebecca described how Sarah spoke about this process with absolute hypnotic conviction. She said that those who underwent the transformation found such profound peace that they no longer needed to return to the world they had left. They simply continued on in another plane of existence, invisible to the eyes of those who remained trapped in material reality. Rebecca admitted that for weeks she truly believed these words and was ready to follow Sarah to that special place. Only the intervention of a cousin who visited her unexpectedly broke the spell and brought her back to reality. Based on this information, Blackwood developed a theory that he presented to both Sheriff Reynolds and the Tennessee authorities. He believed that Sarah had not killed her victims in the conventional sense. Instead, she had driven them to a mental state where they willingly submitted to death through methods Sarah presented as spiritual transcendence. Perhaps extreme fasting to the point of starvation, perhaps exposure to the elements during prolonged rituals in cold caves, perhaps even more subtle methods that left no obvious marks of violence. Blackwood's theory would explain why there were no signs of struggle or resistance, why the victims seemed to cooperate willingly until the end, and why there were no bodies in the caves. Sarah simply discarded them in remote mountain locations where they would never be found, or left them in deep, inaccessible chambers of the cave complex that explorers had been unable to reach. The neatly folded clothes and farewell letters suggested that the victims truly believed they were participating in something sacred, not realizing they were walking toward their own destruction. The Civil War ended in April 1865, and with it came a reorganization of government priorities. Resources that had previously been impossible to obtain began to be directed toward resolving accumulated civil problems. Sarah Denton's case finally received official attention at the federal level. Government agents were dispatched to coordinate efforts across states and attempt to locate the woman who was now officially wanted on multiple charges, although the exact nature of her crimes remained elusive. It was during this period that a promising lead emerged. A telegraph operator in Atlanta, Georgia, reported a strange conversation he had had with a missionary woman in July 1865. She had asked for directions to Alabama and Mississippi, war-torn regions where entire communities had been destroyed and survivors wandered in shock and despair. The telegraph operator, who had read about Sarah Denton in the newspapers that were finally beginning to circulate freely with the end of the conflict, was under the impression that this woman fit the description. Reynolds immediately set off for Georgia, but by the time he reached Atlanta, any trace of Sarah had gone cold. She had disappeared once again, possibly heading toward the most devastated regions of the Deep South, where the post-war chaos created perfect conditions for her operations. Thousands of people were displaced, families had been torn apart, and official records were in disarray or completely lost. It would be the ideal environment for someone like Sarah Denton to operate undetected. During the fall of that year, reports began to arrive from various parts of Alabama and Mississippi. Unexplained disappearances of war widows, traumatized veterans, elderly people who had lost everything in the conflict. The patterns were eerily familiar: increasing social isolation, involvement with a traveling missionary, prolonged sessions of prayer and fasting, and finally complete disappearance without a trace. But confirming that it was really Sarah Denton was impossible. It could be her, it could be others taking advantage of the chaos. It could simply be the terrible coincidence of desperate times. Attorney Blackwood published a detailed pamphlet in November 1865, warning communities throughout the South about the dangers of accepting help from itinerant missionaries, unaffiliated with established churches. He described Sarah Denton's modus operandi in meticulous detail, hoping the information would prevent future victims. The pamphlet was reprinted in newspapers across multiple states and distributed to churches, general stores, and post offices. It was the first time that information about a criminal case had been disseminated so widely throughout the southern United States. The response to the pamphlet was surprising and disturbing. Dozens of people wrote to Blackwood reporting encounters with women who matched Sarah's description or exhibited similar behavior. Some reports came from as far away as Louisiana and Arkansas. A pattern emerged from the letters. always isolated rural areas, always communities still recovering from the war, always vulnerable victims without strong family support networks. It seemed that Sarah, or people operating with identical methods, were spreading like an invisible plague across the ravaged South. The winter of 1865 to 1866 brought a forced pause in the investigation, but also an unexpected development that would shed new light on Sarah Denton's origins. A Presbyterian minister named Amos Caldwell, who served a congregation in rural Bourbon County, Kentucky, read Blackwood's pamphlet and immediately wrote a detailed letter to the lawyer. What Caldwell revealed in that correspondence was both illuminating and deeply disturbing. Caldwell had known Sarah Denton, or at least the woman he believed to be her, for nearly a decade. In 1856, a woman named Sarah Blackwell had arrived in his community as the wife of an itinerant evangelist named Josiah Blackwell. The couple seemed devoted and pious, holding revival meetings in barns and open fields, drawing dozens of worshippers with passionate sermons on redemption and salvation. Caldwell, young and newly ordained at the time, had collaborated occasionally with them, impressed by Josiah's eloquence and Sarah's apparent dedication. But something changed dramatically in the summer of that year. Josiah Blackwell fell suddenly ill during a particularly brutal heat wave. His symptoms were strange: progressive weakness, mental confusion, and occasional seizures. The local doctor could not pinpoint the specific cause and attributed the condition to excessive heat, combined with exhaustion from intense missionary work. Sarah cared for her husband with seemingly unwavering devotion, refusing help from other members of the community, insisting that she alone could provide the necessary care through prayer and herbal remedies. She prepared herself. Josiah Blackwell died after 3 weeks of grief. He was buried in a small churchyard with a simple ceremony. Sarah remained in the community for a few weeks after her husband's death, apparently grieving and lost. Then one September morning, she simply left without warning, leaving behind the couple's few belongings. Caldwell didn't think much of it at the time, assuming the widow had sought solace with family in another state. But now, nearly 10 years later, reading the detailed descriptions in Blackwood's pamphlet, Caldwell began to question everything he had witnessed. He remembered small details that at the time seemed insignificant, but now took on sinister significance. Sarah always prepared Josiah's meals separately from her own, claiming he had special dietary restrictions. She kept an arsenal of herbs and tinctures that she carefully guarded, never allowing others to touch. During Josiah's illness, she had categorically refused to allow the doctor to examine the remedies she administered to her husband, claiming they were sacred recipes passed down through generations of healers in her family. Even more disturbing, Caldwell remembered that after Josiah's death, Sarah had inherited a surprising amount of money. Josiah had casually mentioned, weeks before his illness, that a distant uncle had passed away and left a modest inheritance. Sarah had apparently used this money to finance her departure from the community, but there were also rumors that Josiah had ownership documents for land his family owned in Tennessee. These documents were never found after his death. Blackwood was thrilled by this information. He personally traveled to Kentucky in the spring of 1866 to investigate further. In Bourbon, he managed to locate church records confirming Josiah Blackwell's marriage and death. He also found the doctor who had treated Josiah, a now elderly man named Dr. Marcus Hale. Hale admitted he had always suspected Josiah's death, but at the time he didn't have enough evidence to charge anyone with anything. Hale explained that Josiah's symptoms were consistent with poisoning from certain plants that grew abundantly in the region, particularly water hemlock and foxglove. Given in small regular doses, mixed with other ingredients to mask the bitter taste, these substances could produce exactly the clinical picture Josiah presented, but proving poisoning without a post-mortem examination was impossible, and at that time, no one had reason to suspect a seemingly devoted wife caring for her ailing husband. Blackwood managed to locate some distant Blackwell family members still living in Kentucky. They confirmed that Josiah had inherited land in Tennessee and had ownership documents worth a considerable amount. These documents were never transferred or registered after his death. They simply disappeared. The family assumed they had been lost or destroyed during Sarah's mourning. Now it seemed clear that she had taken them and possibly sold the land using forged documentation. Armed with this new information, Blackwood began searching for earlier records of Sarah's life. He discovered that Sarah Blackwell was likely also an assumed name. A woman matching her description had married Josiah using documents that identified her origin as Virginia, but when Blackwood attempted to trace her family in that state, he found no birth or family records with the surname she had provided. It was as if Sarah Denton, or Sarah Blackwell, or whatever her real name was, had appeared out of nowhere, an entity with no verifiable past. Blackwood's findings suggested that Sarah's operations in the Appalachian Mountains were not the beginning of her criminal career, but possibly just a more refined phase of something she had been doing for much longer. She had started with individual targets, husbands or partners she could control through intimate relationships, before evolving into the more elaborate system of spiritual manipulation she developed during the Civil War years. While Blackwood unearthed Sarah's past in Kentucky, Sheriff Reynolds continued trying to track her down in the present. He had become practically obsessive in his search, neglecting other official duties to pursue every lead, no matter how tenuous. His wife wrote worried letters to the neighboring county sheriff, begging someone to convince Reynolds to rest and let others take over the investigation. But Reynolds was consumed with the need to find Sarah and bring her to justice, not only for the known victims, but for the countless others he suspected existed in places where no one had yet connected their disappearances to the shadowy missionary. During the spring of 1866, Reynolds followed a lead to Mississippi, where reports of a suspicious missionary had surfaced in a destroyed community near Vicksburg. He arrived to discover that 3 people had disappeared in recent weeks, all fitting the typical profile of Sarah's victims. But when he attempted to obtain detailed physical descriptions of the missionary, he found conflicting accounts. Some witnesses described her as over 40, others swore she looked younger. Some said she had grey hair, others insisted it was dark brown. This raised a disturbing possibility Reynolds hadn't considered before. What if more than one person was operating with the same methods? What if Sarah Denton had taught her techniques to others, creating a kind of network of manipulators that spread across the ravaged South? Or perhaps she simply altered her appearance effectively enough that witnesses gave varying descriptions. Wigs were easy to obtain. Simple makeup could add or remove apparent years, and the way someone dressed and moved drastically influenced how they were perceived. The case was becoming increasingly complex and frustrating. Each clue seemed to lead to a dozen more unanswered questions. Each discovery about Sarah's past revealed additional layers of deception and manipulation. And while investigators like Reynolds and Blackwood devoted time and energy to unraveling the mystery, new victims continued to disappear in rural communities across the southern United States. In June of 1866, a grand jury in Haywood County, North Carolina, formally indicted Sarah Denton on multiple counts of fraud, manipulation, and suspected murder. This was the first time official criminal charges had been filed, transforming the case from an informal investigation into a formal legal manhunt. Posters describing Sarah were printed and mailed to sheriff's offices across 16 states. The reward offered for information leading to her capture was $500, a substantial sum that attracted the attention of professional bounty hunters. But Sarah Denton always seemed to be one step ahead. Months would pass without confirmed sightings. Then suddenly multiple reports would emerge from different locations almost simultaneously, making it impossible to determine which was genuine. She had become like a ghost, a whispered presence in the stories of remote villages, a name people mentioned in hushed tones when discussing the unexplained mysteries plaguing their communities. Reverend Thornton, who had followed the investigation from the beginning, wrote in a sermon preserved in his church's archives, "We are confronted not just with a female criminal, but with the manifestation of something deeper and darker in human nature." Sarah Denton represents the capacity we all have to use the faith, hope, and despair of others as tools of manipulation. She is a dark mirror reflecting what we can become when we completely abandon compassion and embrace power over the vulnerable as our sole purpose. We're reaching the point where Sarah Denton's case transcends the story of an individual criminal and becomes something larger, a study of how human predators systematically exploit the weaknesses of social structures, especially during times of crisis and transformation. And the question that haunted everyone involved remained: was Sarah Denton still out there, still operating, still destroying lives under some new name in some new community, unaware of the danger that had arrived at its doorstep? The autumn of 1866 brought a development that would completely change the course of the investigation. An urgent telegram arrived at Blackwood's office in October, sent by a sheriff in Lawrence County in northern Alabama. The content was brief but explosive, A woman matching Sarah Denton's description had been arrested attempting to steal property documents from the local clerk's office. She was being held pending questioning and possible extradition to North Carolina. Reynolds immediately set off for Alabama, traveling day and night with an urgency that bordered on desperation. When he finally reached the small town of Moulton, the county seat, he found the local sheriff, a man named Thomas Briggs, waiting with troubled news. The woman arrested was definitely someone operating under suspicious circumstances, but there were growing doubts as to whether she was actually Sarah Denton. She insisted her name was Martha Wickham and that she had been the victim of a terrible misunderstanding. Reynolds was taken to the cell where the woman was being held. What he saw left him deeply disturbed, but not in the way he expected. The woman was about the right age, wore sober clothing similar to Sarah's description, and there was a piercing quality in her eyes that matched the accounts. But something was off. Her voice was different from what witnesses had described. Her face had features that didn't quite match, and there was a visible scar on her left hand that no previous description of Sarah mentioned. For 3 days, Reynolds questioned the woman extensively. She maintained her story consistently. Her name was Martha Wickham, the widow of a Mississippi farmer, and she was trying to recover property documents she believed had been stolen from her family during the turmoil of the war. She admitted to using questionable methods to try to access the county records, but vehemently denied any involvement in disappearances or itinerant missionary activities. She had never been to North Carolina, had never called herself Sarah Denton, and could provide witnesses who had known her as Martha Wickham for years. Briggs had wired Mississippi to verify her story, and the replies confirmed the existence of a Martha Wickham who fit the description. There were records of her marriage, her husband's death in the war, and legal disputes over property that validated her explanation for being in the Lawrence Registry Office. Reynolds was forced to confront the possibility that he had arrested the wrong person, or worse, that Sarah Denton had created false identities so convincing that they were indistinguishable from real people. After a week of frustrating investigation, Martha Wickham was released due to a lack of sufficient evidence to keep her detained. Reynolds watched helplessly as she departed in a stagecoach, leaving behind only doubt and uncertainty. He would never know for sure whether he had actually found Sarah Denton and she had escaped through a meticulously constructed false identity, or whether he had genuinely confronted an innocent woman whose superficial resemblance to the wanted criminal had caused a terrible mistake. This incident revealed a disturbing truth about the investigation. Sarah Denton had operated in the shadows for so long that it had become nearly impossible to identify her with certainty. There were no photographs of her, no reliable official records, only verbal descriptions from witnesses who had seen her briefly under emotionally charged circumstances. She could be anywhere, using any name, and no one would be able to definitively identify her until it was too late. During the following winter, sightings and reports continued to arrive from various parts of the South, but none led to captures or confrontations. Sarah, if it was indeed her in each case, had become incredibly cautious. The disappearance patterns continued, but now occurred more scattered and less obvious, as if she had learned to space out her operations to avoid raising immediate alarms. Blackwood published a second pamphlet in January 1867, this time focusing not on describing Sarah physically, but on detailing her method of operation. He argued that trying to identify her by appearance was futile, but recognizing the pattern of behavior could save lives. The pamphlet outlined the warning signs: an itinerant missionary with no established church affiliation, a specific interest in isolated and vulnerable people, progressively longer and more intense prayer sessions, encouragement of social isolation, introduction of concepts of transcendence through suffering, and ego dissolution. Blackwood's work began to have an impact. Communities that received and read her pamphlets became more vigilant. Several women operating as Sarah were questioned, and some were driven from villages before they could establish the trust necessary for her method to work. It was unclear how many of these women were actually Sarah in various guises, how many were impersonators copying her methods, and how many were simply legitimate missionaries, unlucky enough to vaguely fit the profile described. It was during this period that an alternative theory about the fate of Sarah's victims emerged, proposed by a private investigator hired by the family of one of the missing persons. This investigator, named Franklin Moore, had spent months exploring the Smoky Mountains with experienced guides, searching for more caves and secluded spots where bodies might have been hidden. He found no new human remains, But he did discover something equally disturbing. Moore found evidence of a network of secret trails connecting different caves throughout the mountains, paths known only to a very few people who had spent decades exploring the territory. He theorized that Sarah may have used these routes to transport her victims to extremely remote locations, perhaps even across state lines, where she held them in prolonged captivity during psychological manipulation. When they finally died, whether from deprivation, exposure to the elements, or more direct methods, their bodies might be discarded in deep ravines, mountain rivers, or cave chambers so inaccessible they would never be discovered. This theory would explain the complete absence of bodies, and also the length of time during which the victims remained under Sarah's influence before finally disappearing. She didn't kill them immediately, but kept them alive and under her control for weeks or even months, perhaps using them for physical labor, companionship, or simply as subjects to satisfy some deep and twisted psychological need to exert absolute power over other human beings. Sheriff Reynolds, though exhausted and increasingly disillusioned about the possibility of capturing Sarah, continued his obsessive search. He had become a tragic figure, consumed by a case that seemed unsolvable. His health was visibly deteriorating. He had aged a decade in just a few years, and his family begged him to give up and let others take over the investigation. But Reynolds could not abandon the victims. He felt a personal responsibility for each missing person, as if each failure to protect them were a stain on his own soul. In the spring of 1867, Reynolds received an anonymous letter claiming to have definitive information on the whereabouts of Sarah Denton. The letter stated that she was operating under the name Sister Grace in an isolated religious community in eastern Tennessee near the Virginia border. The community was described as a group of people who had withdrawn from society after the war, seeking to live according to strict and unconventional interpretations of Scripture. Reynolds traveled to the indicated location, an arduous journey that took nearly a week through difficult mountainous terrain. When he finally reached the community, he found about 20 people living in simple huts, farming enough to survive, and devoting most of their time to prayer and religious study. They were led by a woman who identified herself as Sister Grace, but when Reynolds confronted her, she was clearly too young to be Sarah Denton, no older than 30. Sister Grace explained that the community had been founded by her and her late husband after they both experienced spiritual visions during the war. She denied knowing any Sarah Denton and allowed Reynolds to thoroughly inspect the community. He found nothing suspicious, no sign of Sarah's characteristic manipulative practices, no evidence that anyone was being held there against their will. It was simply a group of people who had chosen an unconventional but apparently sincere and non-coercive religious path. The anonymous letter had been another false lead, possibly sent by someone with a personal grudge against the Sister Grace community and hoping to use Reynolds to cause trouble. Or perhaps it was Sarah's own doing, delighting in sending investigators in the wrong directions, demonstrating her control over the situation, even while remaining invisible. Reynolds would never know the truth, but the incident left him even more desperate and frustrated. Meanwhile, Blackwood continued his historical investigation, attempting to piece together a complete picture of Sarah's past. He uncovered evidence suggesting she may have been involved in at least 2 other suspicious marriages before Josiah Blackwell, both of which ended in the deaths of their husbands, and Sarah inherited modest estates. The records were fragmentary and difficult to verify, scattered across multiple states with inconsistent documentation systems, but the pattern was undeniable. Sarah Denton, or whatever her real name was, had spent decades perfecting her dark art. She had begun with relatively simple crimes of poisoning for material gain, progressed to more sophisticated psychological manipulations, and finally developed a complete system of mind control that turned victims into willing participants in their own destruction. She was, in Blackwood's words, an evolved predator, constantly adapting her methods to exploit new opportunities and avoid detection. The following years brought a gradual shift in the nature of the Sarah Denton investigation. The case, which had consumed so many people's attention during the immediate post-war period, began to cool as new priorities emerged in the rebuilding nation. Sheriff Reynolds died in August 1868 at the age of 52 of a heart attack that many attributed to the stress and exhaustion of his obsessive search. He died without ever capturing Sarah, a fact that his final diaries revealed haunted him until his final moments. Blackwood continued his work more solitarily, turning his investigation into a personal crusade that would last decades. He corresponded with dozens of local authorities across the southern and western United States, collecting reports of suspicious disappearances and trying to identify patterns that might indicate Sarah's presence. His files grew to occupy an entire room in his home, the walls covered with maps marked with colored pins, indicating possible sightings, confirmed disappearances, and communities that had reported the activities of suspicious itinerant missionaries. During the years 1868 to 1872, Blackwood identified at least 47 missing persons cases that matched Sarah's pattern of operation. They were spread across 11 different states, from the original North Carolina to Texas in the west and Missouri in the north. Geographical dispersion made it impossible for any single authority to coordinate effective investigations, and the American legal system of the time simply lacked the mechanisms to handle crimes that crossed multiple jurisdictions in this way. But in 1873, something extraordinary happened. A woman showed up at Blackwood's Asheville office, identifying herself as Emily Warren. She was emaciated to the point of malnutrition, with eyes that held the kind of deep trauma Blackwood had learned to recognize in war veterans. Emily claimed to have been a victim of Sarah Denton and had escaped, the only person he knew who had survived the full ordeal and was willing to tell her story. Emily Warren was 39 when she met Sarah in 1870 in a small Arkansas community where she lived alone after the death of her husband and adult son in a wagon accident that overturned on a bridge. She was devastated, contemplating ways to end her own suffering when Sarah appeared, offering spiritual comfort. What followed was an 18-month period that Emily described as a gradual descent into a psychological hell from which she barely escaped with her life and sanity. Emily provided Blackwood with the most detailed account of Sarah's methods ever obtained. She described how Sarah began with genuine empathy and emotional support, building absolute trust through weeks of deep conversations where she demonstrated a perfect understanding of Emily's pain. Gradually, Sarah introduced concepts such as how suffering was a choice, how personal identity was a prison, and how true liberation required the complete destruction of the ego that kept one trapped in painful reality. The prayer sessions became increasingly long and physically exhausting. Sarah introduced days-long fasts, claiming the body needed to be weakened so the spirit could ascend. She used hypnotic repetition of phrases and concepts, keeping Emily awake for prolonged periods while reciting mantras about transformation and transcendence. Emily described entering altered states of consciousness where she was unsure of what was real, where the boundaries between sleep and wakefulness dissolved, and where she began to genuinely believe that Sarah had extraordinary spiritual powers. After months of this process, Sarah took Emily to a remote location in the Arkansas mountains, an abandoned cabin far from civilization. There, the process intensified dramatically. Emily was kept in near total isolation, seeing only Sarah, eating only when Sarah allowed, sleeping only when she was given permission. She lost all sense of time, unsure if days or weeks had passed. Sarah performed elaborate rituals involving the symbols that had been found in the North Carolina caves years before. The pivotal moment, Emily explained through tears, was when Sarah finally declared she was ready for the final transformation. Sarah described a process that would involve Emily entering a kind of permanent trance through a combination of extreme sensory deprivation and the ingestion of substances prepared by Sarah. Emily would be taken to a special place where her physical body would cease to exist, but her spiritual essence would persist on a higher plane of reality. Sarah spoke about this with such absolute conviction that Emily, in her fragmented state of mind, was prepared to accept it. But something unexpected happened the night before the final ritual. Emily had a vivid dream of her deceased son, who appeared, telling her that she needed to live, that her death would not honor him but would be a betrayal of everything they had shared. Emily awoke with a sudden, terrifying clarity, realizing that she was about to allow Sarah to kill her. In a moment of desperate lucidity, she realized that Sarah was not offering spiritual transcendence, but simply death through methods that masked the reality of what was happening. That same night, while Sarah slept, Emily fled the cabin. She ran aimlessly through the dark woods, tripping over roots and rocks, tearing her skin on branches and thorns. She had no idea where she was or where she was going, only that she needed to get as far away as possible before Sarah woke and brought her back. By extraordinary luck, she found a hunter's trail at dawn and followed it until she reached a secluded farm, where a family took her in and eventually helped her return to civilization. It took Emily nearly 3 years to recover sufficiently from the trauma to seek out Blackwood and tell her story. She still had nightmares every night, still struggled with intrusive thoughts about the ideas Sarah had planted in her mind. But she was determined to help capture Sarah so that others wouldn't suffer the same fate. She was willing to testify in court, identify Sarah personally, do whatever it took to bring justice. Blackwood was deeply moved and energized by Emily's testimony. For the first time, there was a living witness who could provide direct evidence of Sarah's crimes. He immediately began working with Arkansas authorities to locate the cabin where Emily had been held, hoping it might contain physical evidence. He also began the process of getting Emily to provide formal statements that could be used to bolster the legal charges against Sarah. For months, search teams explored the Arkansas mountains, trying to locate the cabin Emily described. She accompanied them on several expeditions, trying to recognize landmarks that could guide their search. But the trauma and altered mental state she had been in during that period made it difficult to separate real memories from distorted impressions. She remembered certain trees, rock formations, the sound of a nearby stream, but she couldn't reconstruct the exact route. Finally, in October of 1873, they found a cabin that matched Emily's description. It was even more dilapidated than she remembered, with the roof partially collapsed and the walls covered in moss and vines. But inside, protected from decay by the dry environment, they found the remains of candles arranged in circular patterns, symbols drawn on the wooden walls, and most disturbingly, several pieces of clothing that Emily identified as having belonged to her. They also found something no one expected, a second notebook of Sarah's similar to the one discovered years earlier near the North Carolina caves. This one contained more recent entries covering the period from 1868 to 1872. The pages revealed that Emily had not been Sarah's only victim during those years in Arkansas. There were references to at least 5 other people, all described as going through the same stages of manipulation and preparation for the final transformation. But unlike Emily's case, the other 5 apparently hadn't escaped. The final entries about each ended with the phrase, "completed the journey," followed by symbols Sarah seemed to use to mark the successful completion of her process. There were no specific details about what happened during this final journey, but the implications were horrifying to contemplate. The notebook also contained Sarah's personal reflections that provided a disturbing glimpse into her psychology. She wrote about feeling chosen for a sacred mission to free souls trapped by the illusion of material existence. She described a traumatic event in her own youth, never clearly specified, that had revealed to her the truth about the illusory nature of physical reality. She genuinely believed, or at least had convinced herself, that she was performing a spiritual service by guiding people through death to what she perceived as a higher form of existence. Blackwood pored over the notebook, trying to extract any information that might help predict Sarah's future movements or understand her motivations. What he concluded was that Sarah Denton was not simply a calculating criminal acting for material gain, though she certainly benefited financially from her victims' estates. She was something more complex and dangerous, a true believer in a twisted ideology she had constructed to justify and give meaning to her horrific actions. This explained why she had managed to operate for so long without being caught. She wasn't feigning religious devotion to manipulate others. She genuinely saw herself as a spiritual figure with a divine mission. This absolute conviction was what made her manipulation so effective, because she truly believed what she was saying and was able to hypnotically convey that faith to vulnerable people, desperately seeking meaning and relief from their suffering. The discovery of the second notebook and Emily Warren's testimony injected new energy into the investigation, but also revealed a dark truth. Sarah Denton was growing bolder and more refined in her methods. The years from 1874 to 1878 brought a series of sightings and incidents suggesting she had expanded her operations into even more remote territories, capitalizing on the expansion into the American West and the chaos that accompanied the establishment of new communities in newly colonized lands. Blackwood received reports of suspicious disappearances in Dakota Territory, Kansas, and even as far away as Wyoming Territory. The patterns were familiar, but adapted to the new environments. Sarah, or women operating with identical methods, appeared in mining camps, small frontier towns, and isolated agricultural settlements. She took advantage of the fact that these communities were transient and poorly documented, where people appeared and disappeared regularly without attracting much official attention. A particularly disturbing case came to Blackwood's attention in 1875, originating from the town of Deadwood in Dakota Territory. A marshal named Seth Bullock reported 4 miners missing over a 6-month period, all last seen in the company of a missionary who was holding services in a tent on the outskirts of town. The miners were solitary men who had had moderate success finding gold, but had no family or close connections who could immediately report their absence. Bullock investigated and discovered that the missionary had left abruptly when rumors of the disappearances began to circulate. She left behind only her empty tent and a few printed religious pamphlets that contained the same theological distortions characteristic of Sarah's writings. More disturbing, Bullock located the mining leases of the 4 missing men and discovered that they had all been transferred to a false name using documentation that later turned out to be fraudulent. Someone had sold these leases and pocketed the money before the fraud was discovered. This case demonstrated an evolution in Sarah's method. She was no longer content with the modest savings and holdings of isolated widows and farmers. She had identified a new type of lucrative victim, men who had found gold or established valuable concessions but lived alone without strong family ties. The frontier territory was perfect for her operations because the law was irregularly enforced, records were poorly kept, and the high mortality from disease, accidents, and violence meant that disappearances were not investigated as rigorously. Blackwood personally traveled to Deadwood in 1876, an arduous journey that took weeks through still dangerous territory. He was now 63, his health declining, but his determination remained unwavering. In Deadwood, he worked with Bullock to track down witnesses and gather evidence. What they uncovered painted a picture of Sarah adapting her techniques to the frontier environment. Rather than spending months cultivating individual relationships, as she did in rural eastern communities, Sarah had accelerated her process on the frontier. She identified potential victims, established initial contact through her religious services, and then moved quickly to isolate them, using the promise of intensive spiritual guidance away from the temptations and distractions of the city. The miners, many of whom carried guilt over abandoning families back east or over questionable actions in pursuit of wealth, were particularly susceptible to her messages of redemption through suffering and purification. Bullock had located an abandoned ranch about 20 miles from Deadwood, where witnesses reported seeing the missionary leading men on spiritual retreats. Blackwood and Bullock, accompanied by a group of 6 deputies, rode to the site on a cold September morning. What they found was eerily similar to previous discoveries in the mountains of North Carolina and Arkansas. The ranch had been empty for months, but evidence of recent occupancy was obvious. There was a main structure with several small rooms, each containing only a narrow cot and no windows, perfect for the sensory isolation Sarah used as part of her process. The walls were covered with the familiar symbols, now recognized as hallmarks of her operations. In the barn, they found an underground chamber that had been excavated and reinforced, a cramped, dark space where victims were likely kept during the most intense stages of the manipulation. More disturbingly, they found a small, unmarked cemetery behind the barn. 5 shallow graves contained human remains in various stages of decomposition. The bodies had been buried without particular care, simply dumped in holes and covered with earth. Preliminary examinations revealed no obvious signs of violent trauma, no broken bones or marks from instruments. The deaths appeared to have occurred through methods that left no skeletal evidence, possibly starvation, dehydration, exposure, or poisoning with substances that do not affect bones. The discovery of the graves finally provided concrete physical evidence of Sarah's crimes. For the first time, bodies could be examined, albeit in conditions that made it difficult to determine exact causes of death. Bullock began the process of trying to identify the remains through personal objects found in the graves and comparisons with descriptions of the missing miners. 3 of the 5 bodies were eventually identified as belonging to men who had been reported missing after attending the missionary services. Blackwood spent weeks in Deadwood, meticulously documenting everything. He was building a case that he hoped would eventually be strong enough to mobilize significant federal resources to capture Sarah. With multiple states and territories involved, overlapping jurisdictions, and now physical evidence of homicide, he argued that the federal government had not only the right, but the obligation to treat Sarah Denton as a national threat requiring federal coordination. Their petitions eventually reached offices in Washington, and in 1877, for the first time, federal resources were officially allocated to the search for Sarah Denton. A small group of federal investigators was assigned to coordinate with local authorities across multiple states and territories. It was a significant step, but it came too late for many victims, and still faced the practical limitations of trying to track down a woman who had demonstrated an extraordinary ability to change identities and disappear at critical moments. Throughout 1878, federal investigators pursued multiple leads across the West. There was a possible sighting in Denver, another in Salt Lake City, reports of a suspected missionary operating among Mormon communities in Utah Territory. Every lead was investigated, but Sarah, if it was indeed her, was always several steps ahead. It was like chasing a ghost that left destruction in its wake, but never stayed anywhere long enough to be captured. Reverend Thornton, now an elderly man in his 70s, wrote a series of theological essays during this period, attempting to understand how the Christian faith could be so profoundly distorted by someone like Sarah Denton. He argued that she represented a particularly dangerous kind of heresy, not a rejection of the faith, but its transformation into something monstrous that retained the language and outward symbols of religion while completely inverting its meaning and purpose. His writings circulated among seminaries and churches, serving as warnings to religious leaders about the dangers of allowing unaffiliated and unsupervised preachers to operate in their communities. Emily Warren, who had become something of a star witness in the case, traveled with Blackwood on several occasions, sharing her story with local authorities and helping train people to recognize the warning signs of Sarah's manipulative techniques. It was deeply traumatic for Emily to relive her experience over and over again, but she felt it was her responsibility to use her suffering to prevent others from experiencing the same horror. She became an eloquent and passionate advocate, someone whose survival carried a purpose that kept her battling her own inner demons. But despite all the efforts, increased resources, and growing public awareness, Sarah Denton remained elusive. Sightings continued. Suspicious disappearances persisted, but no capture was made. It was as if she had become part of the very fabric of the expanding American West, a shadow moving across the edges of civilization, feeding on the lost and vulnerable that the edges of society always produce in abundance. In December of 1878, Blackwood received an anonymous letter that deeply disturbed him. The letter was written in a handwriting he recognized from Sarah's notebooks. It was brief and enigmatic. "You will never understand the gift I offer. I will continue my work until every imprisoned soul is freed. The shadows protect me because they recognize the truth of what I do." There was no signature, only the familiar symbols drawn around the edges of the paper. The letter suggested that Sarah was aware of the investigation, possibly even following it through newspapers and official communications. She was sending a message. She was unafraid of capture because she believed she was under divine protection, or possibly because she had become so skilled at evading detection that she considered the investigators incapable of posing a real threat. It was a gesture of arrogance and defiance that revealed a mind even more disturbed than anyone had imagined. The final years of the 1870s brought an unexpected and deeply unsatisfying conclusion to the Sarah Denton case. In March 1880, Attorney Herbert Blackwood died at the age of 67, a victim of pneumonia aggravated by decades of exhausting travel and exposure to harsh weather during his investigations. He died at his home in Asheville, surrounded by stacks of documents and maps representing over 15 years of obsessive work. His last words, recorded by his daughter who cared for him, were, "She's still out there." Blackwood's death dealt a devastating blow to the coordinated investigation. He had been the central force keeping multiple authorities connected and focused on the case. Without his tireless dedication and the personal resources he invested in the search, the investigative momentum quickly dissipated. Federal investigators were redirected to other priorities, and local authorities returned to dealing with more immediate and tangible crimes in their own jurisdictions. Emily Warren continued to advocate for awareness of the dangers of manipulators like Sarah, but without Blackwood's support and with limited resources, her reach was limited. She corresponded with several religious organizations, warning of the signs of spiritual manipulation and encouraging communities to be vigilant. Her efforts saved lives, though she never knew exactly how many, as prevented tragedies are rarely documented, like those that occur. During the 1880s, sightings of Sarah Denton became increasingly rare and less verifiable. There were occasional reports of suspicious missionaries in remote territories, but determining whether any of them were actually Sarah became impossible. She would have reached her 60s by that decade, but she could easily have altered her appearance or simply retreated to some isolated location where she continued to operate on a smaller scale, away from the eyes of any authorities. Sarah Denton's ultimate fate has never been determined with certainty. There is no record of her capture, trial, or death. She simply vanished into the mists of history, leaving behind only the wreckage of dozens, possibly hundreds, of lives she claimed over 3 decades of operations. Official records conservatively estimate at least 60 confirmed or highly probable victims, but the true number may be much higher, lost in the incomplete records of the Civil War era and westward expansion. The Smoky Mountains caves where Sarah conducted her macabre rituals were eventually sealed by local authorities, deemed too dangerous for casual explorers. The Dakota Ranch was burned to the ground by local vigilantes who believed the place was cursed. Sarah's notebooks were preserved in criminal archives, where they remained forgotten for decades, until they were rediscovered by historians in the 20th century, revealing to modern researchers the full extent of her operations and the disturbing sophistication of her methods of psychological manipulation. Sarah Denton's story serves as a grim reminder that the most dangerous predators don't always use obvious violence. Some destroy through whispered words, empty promises of transcendence, and the calculated exploitation of human vulnerability at its most fragile. She operated in an era where limited communication systems and fragmented jurisdictions created shadows where monsters could thrive unseen, but the psychological methods she employed remain relevant and dangerous even today. The Appalachian Mountains still hold their secrets. Hikers occasionally report finding strange symbols etched in remote caves, abandoned cabins with inexplicable markings on the walls. These are merely echoes of a history most would rather forget, but which must be remembered as a warning of what happens when we allow vulnerable people to fall into the clutches of those who see the suffering of others not as a tragedy to be alleviated, but as an opportunity to be exploited. Sarah Denton, the Appalachian missionary who was too evil for the history books, vanished physically but left a lasting mark on American understanding of the dangers of religious and psychological manipulation. Her story, suppressed for decades because it was deemed too disturbing for respectable public discussion, finally emerged from the dusty archives as testimony to one of the most complex and terrifying criminal cases of the 19th century. If you've made it this far on this dark journey through the misty mountains and buried secrets of American history, subscribe to the channel for more stories that were forgotten or deliberately erased from official records. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this disturbing case, and if you know of other dark stories that deserve to be told, please mention them in the comments. Until the next investigation, where we will continue unearthing the darkest and most disturbing mysteries that the past tried to hide.